Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for attending. This is a webinar on stove innovation in the 1700s, a subject that I've always been fascinated. Well, I'm fascinated by all centuries of stove innovation, and this is the one where it really starts in America. We have three speakers: Joyce Chaplin, Howell Harris, and Sean Adams. And they'll each speak, and then we'll have Q&A. First, a little, oh, can you change the slide, Darian?
Hey, John, you're sharing your screen actually, so you'll have to share that or change the slide.
Oh, there we go. Well, housekeeping. So what we're going to do today, the chat function will be turned off. So if anyone has any questions for the speakers or questions about technical questions, please use the Q&A function. And you can ask questions with the Q&A function at any time, and then we'll save them for the end. So you will but go ahead and put them there now. Afterwards, we'll send all registrants a link with recordings and slides, including those who registered and couldn't join. And if you do need continuing education credit, just email Darian at forgreenheat.org. Okay, and a little about us. So, Lines for Heat is a small nonprofit. We were founded in 2009. We have 4 employees. They're the first 4 photos, and the others are members of our board of advisors and board of directors. And our goal is to promote low-carbon renewable heating, and our specialty is doing it with wood. And one of our major programs has been to try to reinvent the wood stove by making it automated with electronics. And this is really I think in the 1700s is where people started tinkering with automated, various sorts of automation. And our funding comes from the USDA Forest Service currently, almost all of our funding. In the past, we've had funding from DOE and NYSERDA and others. We're based in Maryland, but our staff is all over in Arkansas, Wisconsin, and Wyoming. So, and our next webinars, the next one is harnessing electronics for smarter, cleaner wood heater. And it's a great follow-up to this, because this is what we think will be the future of wood heating. And this, what we're trying to do with automation is exactly what Ben Franklin was trying to do, is to minimize smoke, maximize efficiency, and reduce the amount that the operator has to tinker with the stove. And that was a big frustration for Ben Franklin, as he had some of his designs took too much attention. And that's still to this day a downfall of wood stoves, is you have to be alert often and change the air setting, and humans simply can't do that as well as a electronic sensor. And then after that, we have a chainsaw safety. That's from our USDA funding with our firewood banks, and that's also in June. Okay, so Joyce is first up. And we have a poll. Darian, why don't you announce the first audience poll?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So our first question is, what brings you to our webinar today? I'm sure a lot of y'all are just curious, but we'll see if we have some history wood stove buffs or some historian or academics online here today. I'll give it just a few seconds here, let everyone answer, and then I'll end the poll and share the results.
So I was so pleased to see a book come out last year, about Ben Franklin, written by Joyce Chaplin. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. And then I was able to hear a lecture from her at Mount Vernon in Virginia. And she's eminently qualified to write this, because she has immersed herself in the 1700s in society, technology, and really weaves together all the trends that help someone innovate and It gives a background of why they're innovating and what resources they have. So I won't, I'll let Joyce tell her own story. And Derry, do you want to announce the webinar? Or
Yeah, sure. Let's see here. It looks like most of y'all are environmental energy energy efficiency professionals. But just curious, it's pretty high up there. 31% of y'all are just curious about Benjamin Franklin and stove innovation. So that's really great.
Okay, I'll turn it over to Joyce.
Thank you so much, both for the invitation to be here and for the ongoing work that you are doing for green energy. I do just have a book out. Thank you for mentioning that. That looks at Franklin's attempts to improve indoor heating. While I have this focus on Franklin in the book and in my ongoing research, I do contextualize, as historians do, what his efforts really meant and the constraints and encouragements that existed at the time. So I'm going to talk about 4 reasons that I examine in the book about why people wanted to improve indoor heating during the long 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, whatever you want to call it. And so I list, helpfully, I hope, the 4 main reasons along the side here that I will go through in my presentation. Just noting that the 2 illustrations I have from the famous political cartoonist James Gilroy address item number 4, just the craze or the rage there was for making artificial heat indoors to make life more comfortable and just wonderful for everyone concerned, including the King and Queen of England. So we see here Queen Charlotte and King George snug in front of some coal-burning fireplace somewhere, preparing hot snacks. And so the way in which everyone in the 18th century was supposed to be interested in and engaged with better indoor heating and the things that it could do for you. I think these cartoons spoofing that nevertheless express very accurately why people were interested in having better stoves and fireplaces. The next slide, please. The first reason, however, for inventing better stoves in the long 18th century was because of climate change. Franklin and his contemporaries lived during the Little Ice Age, a period of naturally caused global cooling, so the exact opposite of what we have now, but the last significant change in climate before our own. So the Little Ice Age lasting from approximately 1300 to approximately 1850, and you can see that that's the dip on the far left of this graph before we go into the anthropogenic climate warming that we are experiencing now. The next slide, please. The Little Ice Age featured bad winters when the weather was especially bad. So much so that major harbors in Europe and in the American colonies, early United States, would freeze over, making it possible to have what were called frost fairs, people who would temporarily camp out on the ice, enjoying the incongruity of being able to walk on water outside a major city. In this illustration, it's London. Featuring all kinds of economic possibilities, selling meat roasted out on the ice, gingerbread baked there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So exciting ways in which people enjoyed climate change, but overall, a very, very bad interval. One bad winter took place in 1740 to 1741. When temperatures reached new lows, knock-on effects included bad harvests. There was such prolonged and terrible famine in Ireland, for instance, that it's thought that the mortality rate exceeded that of the Great Hunger, the better known episode of the Irish potato famine in the 19th century. It's this exact winter, 1740 to 1741, which seems to be the big prompt for Franklin. That was when he developed the prototype for his first commercially available stove. So climate change is a background reason to investigate new ways of existing, if not flourishing, in the world, despite natural circumstances not necessarily being encouraging. Reason number one. If I could have the next slide, we'll move to reason number two, resource depletion. So just as the weather was getting bad, cold during the little ice age, so Europe and other parts of the world were experiencing firewood shortages. And as you can see, deforestation has had a long history. This picks up only in about 1700, but there had been significant medieval depredation of forested land. So there is deforestation. Forests and wooded areas are not increasing. This becomes acute. It gets worse until it gets better late in the 20th century. But the cost of fuel wood, therefore, was skyrocketing in a lot of well-inhabited parts of the world, including around Franklin and Philadelphia, whereas he notes firewood needs to be brought into the city at greater and greater distances. He was born in Boston, and he knew that conditions were even worse there. So he feels that people are being pinched between two very bad physical circumstances, changing climate, making conditions colder, and then resource depletion, making it less and less possible, at least at reasonable expense, to warm yourself up. So if I could have the next slide. Franklin's first attempt at a solution, fireplace inserts that he developed starting in that bad winter of 1740 to 1741. A fireplace insert that he developed to use less firewood and nevertheless make a room warmer. He did this by extending the heat source, the burning of the wood, out further into the room. You can see the big lip on the first kind of fireplace insert that he invented. And then he used a complex theory of convection, the tendency of warmed air to expand and to rise, to fill a room more efficiently with less firewood, using these natural principles. The second version of his stove placed an insert into the chimney that expanded the amount of metal that could be heated, therefore retaining heat and sending it back into the room through two small channels, a very early and probably not very good system of forced heat, so an early attempt. Anyway, with these two models, Franklin first addresses the two background causes that he thinks are creating a demand or a need for better heating sources. His two improved wood-burning stoves, if I could have the next slide. Move on to the second two of 5 fireplaces or stoves that Franklin invented. These next two in London, sometime between 1757 and 1774, when he was acting as a colonial lobbyist. He was a paid representative for several colonies in London, living with a landlady who allows him to make modifications to her fireplace. The first being a system of sliding plates that Franklin had designed to channel hot air versus smoke in order to heat the room without filling it with pollution. He doesn't have a diagram for this. He has a description. He claims it's so convincing many people imitated it. He's not satisfied, however, and this is a very interesting phenomenon in terms of his stove inventions. He eventually, as we can determine, invented 5 different ones. Over really half of his life and about half of the 18th century. So indicating continued exasperation over how difficult it was to do this. So the next model abandoned the sliding plates and the rectilinearity of his earlier designs, and he instead makes this enclosed urn-shaped or vase-shaped stove, again, that can fit into an existing fireplace. You don't have to tear up your whole house to install it, that was supposed to emit heat from all sides, channel the smoke so it doesn't enter the room, and therefore, with very small amounts of fuel, you note it's even smaller than the fireplace, with small amounts of fuel, in this case, coal, heat a room more efficiently. And so I do emphasize that both of these models, Londoners and the English in general had been burning coal since the Middle Ages. And by the time Franklin sets up in London, it's really the only available fuel source that he can reasonably use. So on to the final, the fifth and final version of the stove that he developed, if I could have the next slide. On to Paris, where Franklin invents a rotating grate at the request of the Paris or the French authorities during a very bad winter, 1783 to 84, when there is acute fuel shortage and yet really cold conditions, and the French authorities mandate that fuel has to be reserved for baking bread. So regarding the fake anecdote about Marie Antoinette saying, "Let them eat cake," of course, eating bread, availability of bread is a kind of crucial litmus for French authorities. So they were probably quite wise to reserve fuel for baking, not heating. But they don't want people to be cold. So the authorities approach Franklin and say, "Could you help us? Can you make something that will burn very, very small amounts of coal, an emergency fuel still, so that people will be warm enough?" They kind of have Franklin over a barrel. I note that this is exactly the time when he's negotiating the peace treaty. He is very grateful to France for backing the new United States during the war. What is it going to do? Say, "No, I'm not going to help you"? So he obligingly sketches out, it's like a little space heater, and I'm sorry, I don't have a pointer. If you go from the urn stove that we met on the last slide and just move to that central, that kind of circular grate. Thank you so much, somebody. That can actually, it can flip. It can be open, so you can put more coal in it, then shut it back up. You can flip it so it's flat, and then you can cook on top of it. So a very, very, very efficient device that Franklin obligingly invents during yet another bad winter of his lifetime. So this final of three, the last three devices to burn coal, brings me to the third reason for inventing improved heating systems. If I could have the next slide. This is the coal factor itself. The way in which Franklin, as well as many others, is recognizing that coal just has uniquely polluting properties. So again, England and other parts of Europe are at this point dependent on it. And you can see an illustration of the coal trade that brought that fuel down from the north of Britain into big markets like London, but with London especially well on its way to earning its 19th century nickname of the Smoke, because it was so distinctively polluted, to Franklin's horror when he first moves there, complaining in a letter to his wife that there is no fresh air to breathe. He's convinced that there must be a solution to this. People cannot possibly continue to live this way. And a dependence on coal should be a reason to prompt minimizing emissions. He never managed to do this himself for any of his heating devices, as he constantly admits. I want to point out that it's nevertheless a good question to ask, and we haven't actually answered it ourselves. So I really do think that from his time onward, there was a lot of lost time in terms of not pursuing solutions, real solutions to the problems of emissions that begin with consumption of fossil fuels, as coal was. So reason number three is the coal factor. I'll move on to reason number four of improving indoor heating, which I'll call the cool factor. So the next slide. In some sense, what Franklin was inventing was not a better stove or fireplace, but the entire artificial atmosphere indoors, an entirely warmed room, historically very distinctive, and something that probably since ancient Roman hypocasts, underfloor heating, had not really existed. But Franklin thinks it's actually possible that with one heating source in a room, you can nevertheless make the entire room warm. Interestingly, this coincides with a fashion for women's clothing of wearing very light muslin dresses, which would have been impossible most times of the year, let alone winter, in earlier periods where rooms would not have been warm enough. Somebody would have been extremely cold and courting illness to wear that. And again, this becomes so everyday, so commonplace that it's parodied, as with those illustrations of George and Charlotte making their snacks in front of coal fires. Here's a woman setting her fashionable dress alight. The painting over the fireplace of an erupting Vesuvius ought to have been the warning for her. That coal fire is very hot and can set certain things alight. So the advantages of muslin dresses, as Gilray is poking fun at, there are no such advantages. Even as somebody from an earlier period might have marveled that a woman was trying to live indoors in what her grandmother would have worn as a nightgown or underwear. So a way in which you would make life so comfortable within these artificial atmospheres, living indoors, the cool factor, as it were, in the 18th century. Moving on to the next slide, please. Not only an idea about everyday comfort, but a very intellectually stimulating idea for Franklin, because he uses ideas about how convection will warm up an entire room to conceive of how the atmosphere outside, the atmosphere, the big one, how it operated. So he uses that same imagery about how warm air expands and rises to explain several natural phenomena. The movement of storms up and down the Atlantic coast, the behavior of electrical storms, atmospheric electricity, the influence of volcanic forcing, the way in which a volcano erupting in Iceland might send particulate matter even as far as Paris to cool its weather. And Franklin finally used this principle of the movement of warmed fluids to explain the Gulf Stream. So here he is on the final of 3 charts that he did in the Gulf Stream. He's down in the right-hand corner, lecturing Neptune, teaching him a thing or two about how his own ocean circulates. So intellectually productive, this idea of the artificial atmosphere eventually affecting how people would scientifically conceive of the big atmosphere, with this almost comforting sense that humans could imagine themselves as living in nested atmospheres, from the room to maybe a larger building to a town. Franklin also speculates on microclimates to the entire atmosphere. So intellectually productive, again, the final cool factor of reconceiving indoor heating in the 18th century. So with the last slide, just say that of the many ways to think about Benjamin Franklin, I like thinking about him as our founding climate scientist, right? Which is what he did. In terms of investigating what both indoor and outdoor atmospheres were like. I will say that the central lesson that I learned in terms of doing research of this book is that I consider the central question of whether you can invent your way out of climate change, which is what Franklin really wanted to do with his stove, or said might be possible. But I think the central lesson I take away from his experience is that there will be no one specific device that does this. And this is kind of a warning against silver bullet thinking. If we only had X, it would do Y. It will take a lot of devices, a lot of solutions, a lot of new energy sources in order to achieve that. So inventing the devices, yes, bring it on, but placing it within the larger societal context about the good that might do, and the trade-offs. So I will also mention that Franklin's stoves that began to be forged in Pennsylvania were done with enslaved labor and on somebody else's land, the tribal land of the Lenape and Shawnee. And eventually the Franklin stoves burned coal, not a step forward. So in terms of the trade-offs, we do need to think and constantly reinterrogate a very tempting silver bullet, thinking about the kinds of devices and the stress that we put on them that will move us forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Joyce. And Darren, you want to launch our next?
Yeah, I sure will.
And I would just say, yeah, there's a picture of Joyce's book. You know, one thing I loved about her book is she also talked about, you know, he was a publisher. And so he was a magnificent, he had an advertising platform. So I don't think any of us would know nearly as much about his stove if he weren't such a good communicator. And And the other thing about her book is I really appreciate is that he really is the grandfather of the insert, not the stove, because everyone had a fireplace and everyone needed better heat. So he was trying to work with fireplaces and improve them, not really to build stoves per se. Anyway, okay, Darian, you want to announce the results of this poll?
Yeah, sure. Alrighty, so we asked how familiar are you with Benjamin Franklin's work on heating technologies? Most of y'all have heard of the Franklin stove, but not the details, but plenty of others are not familiar at all. So this is going to be a great webinar for y'all. Hang on tight, and we'll get Hal up here next.
Okay, Howell Harris. Howell has really been my mentor in antique stoves. And if any of you want to dig deeply into this, I would urge you to go to his blog, which is called A Stove Less Ordinary. And you will be overwhelmed by the amount of detail that this man has done about American stove history. Howell, take it away.
Well, thanks very much, John. My aim here in my presentation is just to provide some context on 18th century, and I'll follow Joyce in thinking of the long 18th century, which kind of ends roundabout during the War of 1812. I'm going to talk about 18th century American stoves other than Franklin's. And especially stoves that are made and used in mid-Atlantic states. Because really, if you want to talk about stove users and stove makers in 18th century America, you're talking about a few counties in and around Philadelphia, with Philadelphia itself becoming the biggest market for stoves, and in due course, a kind of a center of innovation itself. But from my point of view, I'd say that focusing on the 18th century as a period of innovation gets us to the threshold of when things really started to happen in the United States. And there you're talking about the War of 1812 and the 1820s, the development of more of a nationwide and simply a region-wide industry. So by the very end of the 18th century, even in the only stove, what we'd call stove-intensive region in the United States, Franklin's are just one of the sorts of stoves in use. Even when simplified by the scientist David Rittenhouse at the end of the 18th century, simplified Franklin's were widely available in the mid-Atlantic states and found in significant numbers of households in Philadelphia and elsewhere. That's the 1790s, but where do we begin? Way, way back in the earlier 20th century, in the early 18th century. This is the original stove that you can find in the United States, not in the United States, in the British colonies. It's a European style. It's imported by and with Pennsylvania Germans. So you find it in a few counties in the Philadelphia hinterland. Very few of these survive. But what you can see is that they are, you can think these are actual stoves. These are closed boxes. But the jam stove is a funny kind of closed box because if you look at it, where's the fire? Where's the flue? The text on the slide explains it, but even better, the next slide, please, the next slide. Yep, there we have it. So the stove sits one side of a central chimney in a house, and the conventional kitchen fireplace is the other side. And you take the fire You take a fire from the kitchen fireplace, you load it into the jam stove, it shares a common chimney, and the hot iron plates provide comfort in another room, the other main ground floor room in the house. This was called the stube, and the English stove comes from that source. So it's the room that's warmed that's called that we can think of as a stove. The stove itself is known to the Pennsylvania Germans as an ofen, an oven. Next slide, please. Jam stoves, as you can see, are extraordinarily simple devices. They're made of 5 heavy iron plates clamped together. In late colonial America, if you wanted a really fancy stove, like for example, you wanted to give a grand present to the House of Burgesses of the colony of Virginia, if you were the retiring governor, there was only one way that you could do that. You had to import the goods. And this is one of 2 stoves that Lord Beautetour imported in 1770, and that the Virginia House of Burgesses treasured ever after. The quality of casting, the elaboration of design, the magnificence, and one might say the efficiency, with one air heating box piled on top of another. So the fire's in the bottom, the second stage is an air heating box, and in the other stove, there's a third heating box on top of it. These are streets ahead of anything that Americans are making or using at the time. But the poor old the simple jam stove does get improved, and we'll see the improvement in the next slide. Sorry, I can't actually see my own presentation. This is yet another, the American version of a space heater like the Beautetour stove. More or less the same period, made in Pennsylvania, and crude as anything. But you can see it has some, at least, features that we would think of with a proper stove. It's closed, you can control the draft to an extent, and every available bit of heat that you're producing from the fire within it is going to be available in the room. These are really high output devices, and why do you need such a thing? Answer, because Americans, of course, had other sorts of space, interior space that they needed to heat, not just living rooms. Churches, in particular, created the demand for innovation in order to make them tolerable, not comfortable, just tolerable in the cold American winters. Next slide. And here is the most useful kind of stove that becomes general in Pennsylvania and becomes available in other colonies in the last years, last colonial years. The thing about the 6-plate stove is that it's closed. It has its own flue using a sheet iron pipe, either into an existing fireplace or vented out into the open. This makes them very flexible. You can move them within the house. You can even move them from house to house. You can dismantle them into 6 separate plates in a stand for ease of movement from one place to another. The 6-plate stove, the original box stove, is the device which begins to turn stoves from a kind of a Pennsylvania German peculiarity into something that British Americans, that English colonists and settlers adopted themselves. and made too. As you can see, this is made at Hopewell Furnace. This is a product of Anglo-America, not of German America. Next slide. And the 6 plate is the origin, with one significant innovation, of a truly revolutionary device. It doesn't look much, but the key thing about the 10 plate stove is that you could cook in it. You could use a Franklin, or you could use the top of a 6 plate stove for warming food. With this, you could actually cook, you could bake. Now, the essential use of heat in the 18th century household, 18th and 19th century household, is not to keep people warm, it's to cook. To heat water, those are essential. The heating of the kitchen, in ordinary households, the only heated room, is a kind of a desirable, but in summer, an undesirable byproduct of the principal purpose cooking. The 10 plate stove might have been invented in the United States, but I think we can wrap the word invention in double quotation marks. As with the 6 plate stove, we're looking at something which is much more a reinvention within the United States, or of a well-established North European design. Next slide, please. This I rather like, because it's an extraordinarily fine quality of casting. Stoves, even from this early date, became decorative rather than purely functional. They're important items of furniture. And you will find them not just in the kitchen, but you'll find 10 plate and or 6 plate stoves in public buildings. They're made in different sizes, and you could use a monster size of this to keep your church above freezing, even in the New England winter. And they become, by degrees, more and more sophisticated. This is only a few years younger than the Maybury stove in the previous slide, but notice the extra hatches in the front plate of the stove for controlling airflow, poking the stove, cleaning soot from above the oven. These became standard features. There's only one thing that you won't see on a stove of this vintage, and that's somewhere where you can boil food, where you don't just bake it in the oven, but you put the pot on. Next slide, please. There's a separate kind of box stove that developed in New England, not in the mid-Atlantic states. Much, much less influential, much less widely sold, heavy, crude, and purely functional. This has no particular name. I call it the New England box. But what it is, some of you may be familiar with this from visiting any kind of shaker museum in the United States. The shaker stove is a derivation of this. The New England box stove kind of dropped out of production for the commercial market in the early 19th century because it was simply heavier, cruder, less decorated than, plainer, in most ways less attractive than a 10 plate that by then you could acquire, you could buy anywhere across New England and from, well, places north and east of Philadelphia. Next slide, please. And there's a third independent stove region in the United States. Sorry, not in the United States, in North America. Has its own separate origins, its own modes of production. And this is an interesting thing that's often left, often neglected as part of the tradition of ignoring Canada. Canada, the poor, relatively poor habitants, rural dwellers of Quebec, even ordinary peasant households in Quebec were stove heated by the 1770s, whereas you'd have to wait at least another generation or two before you could say the same thing about the spread of stove heating in by then the United States. Next slide, please. See, this is a New England six-plate stove of at least the 1790s. Rather cruder than the Québécois, but it's change in its function, you can see. This is purely a space heating device. Unlike the 6-plate or the 9-plate, it's not something that you can use in a more versatile way within the household. Next slide. And this is where we get by the very end of the 18th century. It's a 9 or 10-plate stove in terms of its overall function and design. It's hardly different from those that emerged in the 1760s. What is different is the mode of production. The skills of American furnace operators and their teams of pattern makers and molders had developed quite remarkably over two generations. The consequence was that they could cast thin rather than thick plates. They could cast any elegant design onto the surface that they wanted to produce. They could cast curved plates rather than crude slab-sided plates. And this is the style that came to be known in the 19th century as Old Philadelphia, the Old Philadelphia style. And the interesting thing about the Old Philadelphia style is that even in a century of fantastic innovation in stove design and manufacture, these were still popular and saleable for about a century after they were invented. Next slide, please. The classic Old Philadelphia form in its mature form. The big change here is not just the larger oven and the smaller firebox. The big change is the introduction of the cooking hole under that cover at the front, so that you could griddle, you could fry, you could boil, you could do a whole variety of cooking operations on the one stove and keep the kitchen warm into the bargain, and do this all in an efficient way. Next slide. There you see a big 6-plate stove used as a church heater with an air heating drum on top. As Joyce said, Americans by the end of the 18th century, and not just Americans, were interested in internal comfort. They were interested in comfort to be achieved in an efficient way. So this is why you get the air heating drum on top, because without knowing the science, American people understand that the feeling of warmth that you get is partly, generally speaking, about 1/4 to 1/3 of it is from radiant heat, and the other 2/3 to 3/4 is from convected heat. It's from the air temperature. The great advantage of a stove like this is that it produces a huge amount of convected heat, but you also get plenty of radiation from the stove body. Next slide. Yep. Where did we get to? Like I said, my aim was to provide context. Stove ownership and use, even in southeastern Pennsylvania, is quite unusual. It's common enough, but it's not very common at the time of the American Revolution. Even by the 1790s in Chester County, which is in the kind of the Philadelphia urban region, a prosperous farming community on the Delaware River. Only about a quarter of households, or a quarter of estates rather, had stoves in the 1790s. But in Philadelphia itself, the center of the stove region, you get something approaching universal use. Public buildings and relatively wealthy homes were full of them. The rate of increase in use was quite stunning. And of the stoves in use by the early 1810s, about 3/4 were closed types. That's to say 6 and 9 or 10 plates. 40% of them used for cooking, 35% just for heating. And about the other quarter were open stoves, including Franklin types and the simplified Rittenhouse types, just for heating. Supplementary devices within the household. By the very beginning of the 19th century, I think one can say we have at least reached the threshold of a period when stove manufacture and stove use and stove ownership would turn from something which you essentially only found in the middle Atlantic states, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and areas reasonably conveniently close to them.
Hi, Hal. I don't want to interrupt too much, but
sorry.
you're at the 20-minute mark.
Do it.
It's okay.
Do it. That is it. There's my context, and over to Sean. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Howell. That was excellent, and really shows the depth of technology and sophistication around the time of Franklin. And Darren, you want to launch? I think this is our last poll.
Yep, it's our last one here. More of a general question about wood heating, and in terms, where do you see it as part of a sustainable energy future?
I just do want to add, well, first of all, I see some good questions coming in, and keep them coming. Hopefully we'll be able to answer them all. And I think Howell's presentation shows that, Franklin really was trying to, he was improving an insert of a fireplace, not really a stove. And that's one, maybe the biggest misconception about Franklin. But his innovation was important nonetheless. Okay, we're going to turn this over to Sean in a minute. We ready to finish up this poll, Darian?
Yep, we are. So it looks like most of y'all think yes, definitely, to cleaner wood heating as a part of a sustainable energy future, which is great to hear. And then plenty others very fairly say possibly with the right technology. Great to see.
Okay, thanks, Darian. Sean, believe it or not, a professor in Florida is interested in this topic, and I recently bought his book. Oh, you can't really see it very well there. Anyway, the book is Home Fires: How Americans Kept Warm in the 19th Century. And it is also a fabulous book, and I don't get any portion of sales, but encourage anyone that is really interested in this topic. It rounds out Joyce's book and Harris's blog. So with that, Sean, take it away.
Sure. Thank you so much, John. And thanks for talking about Home Fires. My favorite, or maybe least favorite review of that on Amazon is that somebody said, this book is not at all about how to build an efficient fire in your fireplace. So, which I thought, was interesting, because that's not my point in it. My point in it was to talk about home heating as an issue of energy transitions. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Joyce and Hal have really laid out a fantastic story about the Franklin stove and about stoves in general. And I guess what I'm going to do now is, as the results of that poll suggested, most of y'all think that wood fuel is a great alternative. I often play this role as a historian of the coal industry of bringing in the kind of dirtiest type of fuel and talking about how Americans became addicted to it and how we became, in many ways, utterly dependent upon it for home heating, for creating that what I think Joyce very eloquently called the kind of internal environment, the idea of warming rooms, which, believe it or not, was a kind of new idea in the late 18th century. The John Crowley, a historian, has called it the invention of comfort, which I think is a really interesting way to put it. We take it for granted now, but it was not so easily accessible at the time. So if you notice the slide I'm showing here, so I'm going to take up the story in the 1790s and then kind of continue it up through the 19th century, sorry. So what I'm really doing is kind of extending chronologically the period forward to talk about the energy source that a lot of people are burning in these stoves. And what's really interesting is I wanted to show you guys all sorts of images from the 1790s when there was a pretty massive fuel crisis, at least in the northeastern cities of the United States, Boston, New York, Philadelphia. We're really running short on wood fuel. And the problem is you can't find many contemporary images that show what the landscape would have looked like, which was what I'm showing you here from actually the Chesapeake area in the 1790s, which is a kind of landscape of stumps. When we go to national parks now and we go to, for example, battlefield parks, and we see these wonderfully forested areas, that's not what the landscape looked like in most populated areas of the United States, right? It would have been clear-cut for farming. And what that meant from my perspective is that it would have meant that that you wouldn't have had as much wood fuel. And so beginning in the 1790s, what we started to see, the 1780s, 1790s, was a real kind of pretty severe fuel crisis in the United States in terms of wood fuel becoming more and more scarce. And if so, you want to do the next slide, please? The great example I use of this, and I talk about it in my book, is the Liberty Tree, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. We don't have any extant images of the Liberty Tree, but this is from 1865. Obviously a rallying point for Boston, a massive tree, folks hung lanterns, it became a kind of symbol of protest, and then of course a symbol of crushing power when the British actually chopped it down. And what I found interesting about it as a historian of energy is that a lot of people claim that they got 14 cords of wood out of the Liberty Tree. That's probably an exaggeration. A cord is 4 by 4 by 8 stack of wood. A pretty massive tree will produce 4 cords of wood. So the idea of the Liberty Tree producing 14 cords of wood, probably not accurate, but a great story anyways, right? And the idea that the Liberty Tree, this symbol of kind of liberty, would be used and burned in fireplaces is actually kind of part and parcel for what was going on in the late 18th century. For example, in New York during the occupation, during the American Revolution, many ornamental trees were chopped down and used for firewood. Furniture was chopped up and used for firewood. There were real severe shortages of stocks of firewood beginning as early as the early 18th century in New England. In fact, Harvard University used to send ships up to Canada to bring back firewood as early as the early 18th century. So you had a real fuel crisis, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make here. And by the 1790s, for example, in 1796, the American Philosophical Society had a contest for, it was, I believe, a $60 prize for coming up with the best innovation to benefit the poorer class of consumers. Wealthy people, as Joyce and Hal have demonstrated, could afford to install Franklin stoves and these kind of insets in their fireplaces. But for poor people, it was a real struggle. You know, firewood was a spot market. It was largely farmers bringing firewood in and selling them, in kind of impromptu markets in urban areas. And of course, as the winter progressed, and particularly in severe winters, you'd have a real scarcity of that. So the solution, what's the solution? And next slide, please. The solution in these areas is anthracite coal. I wanted to show you guys an image of anthracite coal, and what's great is I found it on Walmart. Walmart will apparently ship you a box of nut coal. And now 2 pounds at $21.70 is no person in the 19th century would pay this amount. That's outrageous. Usually a ton of coal costs between $4 and $5. But this is what anthracite coal looks like. And the reason I wanted to show it to you is it is known as stone coal, colloquially. And in Philadelphia, so I'll limit the story to Philadelphia. Hal kind of talked about Philadelphia as a kind of center of innovation in home heating, and it really was. And in part, it was because Philadelphia becomes the focus of the drive to use more anthracite coal, to substitute wood fuel for fossil fuel, for anthracite. And on the one hand, you guys might think of it from our common perspective as, well, this is very simple. You just simply substitute wood for coal. But if you really think about it, it's a difficult transition. Folks had been burning wood for thousands of years, right? Now, in the UK, as Joyce mentioned, there was a kind of tradition and culture of burning coal, bituminous coal, right? Which is actually, so if you want to know the difference, I've explained this all the time. I assume that everybody knows the difference between the anthracite and bituminous coal. Basically, ranks of coal are based on percentages of carbon. And so anthracite coal has a very, very high percentage of carbon. It's why it's so hard. It's around 98 to 95% carbon, very, very few impurities. Bituminous ranks go down into the 70%. So there's a lot of impurities in that. So when you burn bituminous coal, it ignites much easier than anthracite coal. You can throw it on a regular fire and it will burn, but it produces a lot of smoke and soot. And it's why London was so foggy. You know, the famous London fog was in fact coal smoke. And so bituminous fires are smoky. Anthracite fires, by contrast, are not as smoky because it tends to be a pure fuel. Next slide, please. And anthracite coal, now anthracite coal does exist in the UK, although most of the coal burned in the UK is bituminous. Anthracite coal has a very, very dense and compact field in the United States, in eastern Pennsylvania. And so what you've seen here is my crudely drawn adaptation from my book showing you the anthracite fields and bituminous fields. The United States generally, and I'm currently writing a book about the Industrial Revolution that talks about how energy intensive the United States is, particularly in terms of fossil fuels. The United States has been referred to in the 1970s, and I kind of love this comparison, as the Saudi Arabia of coal, which I think is very telling that they use that analogy. There is a lot of coal in the United States, and particularly in the eastern seaboard of the United States. And you can see here the bituminous fields range all over western Pennsylvania into what is now West Virginia and Ohio, in Illinois. Now, of course, the #1 coal producing state is actually Wyoming. And that is very, very, very low carbon fuel, coal. It's lignite, actually. I want to say it's around 50 or 60% carbon. But the coal that we're talking about here in the 19th century is largely bituminous and anthracite. And what you can see is that the anthracite fields are located in the mountains of eastern Pennsylvania, very, very actually conveniently located for a place like Philadelphia. Next slide, please. And so during the War of 1812, when any kind of fuel that you would have received, in fact, it's strange to think about, but they actually did import coal from the UK to the United States. That would have been cut off. And you had this fuel crisis. And so the idea was, where are we going to get fuel to warm our houses? And so during the War of 1812, what we see is a pretty sustained effort by a guy by the name of Jacob Sist to try to promote anthracite coal as an alternative to wood fuel. Now, at first, attempts to introduce anthracite coal were dramatically unsuccessful. In fact, the first time that anthracite fuel was introduced in Philadelphia in the early 19th century, they couldn't ignite it. Anthracite coal is very, very dense. And so what that means is if you throw it on a fire, it might put it out. And in fact, that's what happened at the first trial run. And the first kind of unfortunate entrepreneurs to bring anthracite to Philadelphia were basically called fraudulent and were chased out of town. And they used anthracite. They actually crushed it up and used it to pave the streets. What you need to burn anthracite coal is you need to have a very, very hot tinder. You need to have basically a wood fire that will create a heat intense enough to ignite the anthracite coal. You can't just throw it on an existing fire. And so you needed a particular type of stove. Now, Jacob Sist not only marketed anthracite, but what he also did, the reason why he was successful when others had failed, is he marketed the Lehigh coal heating stove, and you can see it here. Now, obviously, as Hal talked about, and as Joyce talked about earlier in terms of the Franklin stove, this is really an innovation that is meant for wealthy folks. In fact, coal early on was known as the fuel of the fashionable. And you can see here, this is a pretty decorative stove. In fact, I looked at, when I was doing research for my book, I looked at a lot of trade catalogs. And what I find fascinating about some of these trade catalogs of early stoves is they would say things like, so stoves would often have a decorative function because the idea was you were putting them in your parlor, right? You were putting them in a place where you receive people. And so the last thing you would want is some ugly just box in your room where you receive people. So they'd have things like busts of George Washington. And the trade catalogs would say things like, well, one year they would have, we're introducing a new design. It's got a bust of George Washington. The next year they would say, you should be warned that children should not touch the bust of George Washington because it tends to heat up, right? And so this early design of stoves was actually pretty expensive. I mean, would have been well beyond the reach of many Americans. And in fact, what's interesting about the transition from wood coal to, or rather wood fuel to anthracite coal, is that it was very difficult. Next slide, please. As late as the 1830s, for example, this is a comical cartoon. I always show my students this and they're like, well, it's not that funny, but I think it's pretty funny as a historian of energy transitions. And essentially what this is called is antiphlogistic, and it's showing the struggles to light an anthracite coal fire. Now, in this regard, I know I'm speaking to a room of experts, so I can actually assume that you guys all know this is an inset. This is a coal grate, right, in a fireplace. And what this is showing is basically somebody putting anthracite into their fire grate, trying to light it as you would bituminous coals, for example, in the UK, and not being able to do it. And I'm not going to read you the entire kind of dialogue in here, but essentially it's saying, this anthracite, Rhode Island was an early kind of false start in anthracite coal. There's a small anthracite field in Rhode Island. And it's saying basically, if this is what Rhode Island coal is like, then, in a general conflagration, the last place I'm going to go is Rhode Island because it won't ignite. And so this was the struggle that a lot of people had with anthracite, is you had to kind of train people in how to light it. And so you had newspaper articles, you would have exhibits in the early 19th century, for example, in hotels, that would show you how to ignite a coal stove. And what they would do is conveniently sell you both the coal stove, but then also sell you the anthracite, right? And so what ends up happening is, next slide, please, is you get a system in which you had two main feeders into the Philadelphia market. You had the Schuylkill Navigation Company and the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company. Now, what's interesting about this division is the Schuylkill Navigation Company had, in their charter, they were allowed to transport coal but not mine it. The Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company had a charter to both mine and transport coal. So what the Schuylkill Navigation Company found out was the only way they're going to make money is through shipping massive amounts of anthracite into Philadelphia. And the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company followed suit. And so what you had was this kind of ocean of anthracite beginning in the 1820s coming down into Philadelphia at a time when folks were very, very receptive to it. Next slide, please. And as what you can see is if we crunch the numbers here, you can see that both the Schuylkill Navigation Company and the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company both had incentives to ship as much coal as possible into Philadelphia. So Philadelphia becomes the epicenter of this new regime of coal-burning stoves that is dependent upon a constant flow of fossil fuel into urban areas. It eventually expands into Boston and New York via waterways and via railroads eventually, to the point where most households by, say, the 1830s and 1840s, with the advent of both cheap and affordable coal stoves, but also cheap and affordable anthracite coal, are using that to heat their homes. And although the environmental repercussions of this are pretty disastrous, at least in terms of a comfort wise, it works really well. To the point where I'm going to take the story way far in advance, and I'm finishing up here, but I'm going to have to show you guys a flurry of slides. One of the things that I try to do in home fires is talk about the industrial hearth. And what I mean by that is the coal stove was simply one point in a large string of transactions that involve thousands of Americans. And so, next slide, please. So Charles Barnard in 1874 wonders, he's trying to think about an article to write. And so he says, I wonder where the coal from my hearth comes from my coal stove. And so he embarks on this journey where he goes to the original source of the coal and he's going to trace it from hod, he says, from mine to hod. And so he goes originally, this is a miner in Pennsylvania, as you can see, tearing literally the anthracite coal from a seam. Next slide, please. He then follows it up to where the breakers, and these are actually adult breakers. What Charles Barnard was really shocked to see was that young boys as young as 12 and 13 actually breaking the coal into those small kind of nut pieces that I showed you earlier. Next slide, please. He then follows it to the areas where it's loaded onto these canal boats, shipped down to Philadelphia. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm going really fast. To Port Richmond, which was, again, the epicenter of anthracite coal, where these massive coal barges are coming down involving thousands of people, coal carriers, and haulers, they were called, that are unloading the coal from the canal boats onto railroads where it would be shipped throughout the United States, mostly in the urban Northeast. Next slide. To these coal dealers, which is a brand new profession in the 19th century. It's an easy entry, easy exit market, so that actually coal dealers were among the one kind of profession that actually a lot of, for example, African Americans could get involved in. A lot of folks that were of relatively modest circumstances get involved in. And this is a street scene from Philadelphia. You can see very, very small scale organizations that are taking this coal and marketing it individually. Now, because most people, as people today complain about utility prices, no one loves their utility company. You very rarely hear people say, oh, I really like my utility company. They deliver great value at a low cost. The same way people complained about coal dealers. They always thought that coal dealers were ripping them off, to the point where by the late 19th century, there's a whole slew of coal dealer jokes making fun of them as kind of sharp dealers and people ripping them off. But they were essential. They played an essential role. Next slide, please. And then once the coal dealer eventually delivered the coal into the coal cellar, Charles Barnard, and this is him, this is our Charles Barnard from 1874, delivering that coal that it was a product of thousands of people up to his hearth. So this transition was complete by the late 19th century and had improved the material lives of Americans, at least in terms of staying warm, but had massive, massive consequences. Because as you can imagine, this system that had developed is very, very hard to get rid of. And so, although I admire excuse me, y'all's optimism about replacing fossil fuels with wood. I hate to say it, but I wonder how easily that will be done because the investment of time and energy and money in this fossil fuel economy we have is pretty huge. And I would argue that it starts all with home heating. It starts with home heating. That's how we became, if you want to know the question, how we became addicted to fossil fuels, it's not cars, it's home heating. And that's where I'm going to end it.
Oh, thanks so much, Sean. Fascinating. I remember my grandfather telling me his coal furnace, he hired someone to come in, I think only twice a week. You could load that thing up and it would go for 3 or 4 days. And then it seemed to work great. I should say that that last poll question wasn't about replacing, it's more whether, wood is going to remain as, maybe 2 to 5% of the population will keep heating with wood, and whether wood has enough social license to keep doing so. I know over in England, in London especially, the wood stoves are getting really trendy, and it is causing real problems because in urban areas, wood or coal. I guess coal was even worse, but wood is not so suited to real urban areas. Anyway, so I want to jump to the questions. And what I think we should do is maybe just have one of you answer them so we can well, before we do that, do you guys have any questions of each other? Anything that you want to know?
I think we've been surprisingly complimentary, given that we didn't actually collaborate to figure out who was going to do what.
Agreed.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to go through these sequentially. And maybe if just one or at most 2 of you would answer, because otherwise it'll take too long. Did the initial stove, and I assume they're talking about the Franklin stove, also produce a lot of smoke into the room that it was heating? So that's probably for Joyce.
This has been a vexed question. I would say that the fact that Franklin invented 4 more stoves indicates that probably he didn't think he got it right. So our assumption is that Franklin, toward the end of his life, publishes a whole essay on the problem of smoky chimneys, basically saying there are 1,000 variables. Good luck. And it sounds as if, if your house is at the right elevation and you had the perfect weather patterns and one of his stoves, then maybe there wouldn't be a very smoky room. But there were 2, it's a complex system. And he's right. Trying to heat an indoor space with something actually burning means you're going to have smoke in the house.
Just following on from that, the most important effect of Rittenhouse's changes, simplifications of Franklin's design, were to make it easier to draw, easier to light, easier to sustain. What that involved was sacrificing some of the efficiency that Franklin had aimed for and replacing it by usability. And the result was, and we actually do know about, people became interested in the efficiency of devices in the early 19th century. What one might call the mature version of the Franklin stove, even with the addition of doors to enclose it, was about the least efficient. It was the simplest and about the least efficient of the kinds of devices that were available to Americans, for stove heating by then. And that was part of its attraction. You got something where you could see the fire and it would draw well. So if that meant a sacrifice of efficiency, so be it. People were prepared to do that.
The trade-off. Let me just mention that in some ways, the greatest afterlife for the Franklin, fireplace or stove is in northern Italy. Part of the story I didn't ever really realize, but he remains famous there until the early 20th century. And I note that the early 19th century novel by Stendhal, The Charterhouse of Parma, has a famous burning incriminating documents scene where it all goes wrong. There's just no way to burn a lot of stuff very quickly without filling the room entirely with smoke. And this is such a common problem, everyone recognizes that it's the noblewoman, the aristocrat who probably doesn't tend her fireplace herself, who nevertheless knows what to do as the room is filling with smoke. So it's just not a problem that's really ever solved.
Yeah, and still today, a lot of people still want a fireplace. They want to open. They want to see the flame. Unfortunately, some want to smell the flame.
Yeah.
We all know. Even back then, I guess they knew it wasn't good for you. Okay, next question. In America, were they using masonry heaters as well as stoves back in the 1700s?
Answer yes. The earliest Quebecois stoves were masonry stoves, because, you know, iron is actually quite expensive. One reason that we have so very few surviving 18th century stoves is that the normal fate of an old stove is to be traded in and melted down. And in the early 19th century, the very early 19th century, there's a brief enthusiasm for what are called Russian stoves in the United States, which are complicated masonry heaters, which work on the basis of building up a kind of a mass of warm brickwork and using that to provide sustained comfort that lasts day after day, all through the night with negligible attention. But they were expensive. The great thing about cast iron stoves, especially after the manufacture of them had improved by improvements in casting technique, reductions in weight and cost and everything like that. The great advantage of them is that they become quite cheap. So you have a relatively efficient technology that's also relatively affordable. And given the mobility of Americans, it's something that you can take with you, which with a masonry heater, you can't.
Yeah.
I think the other interesting point about that is, and I talk about this a little bit, is, you know, John, your point about people like to see a fire, that was a very, very strong cultural element in early America, and it was against stoves. And the idea was one of the reasons why stoves took off in Pennsylvania, at least one of the arguments is because they had a large German population who had been familiar with that and kind of brought that technology over. English folks liked a big roaring fireplace, right? That's a kind of cultural preference. I should also say, you know, John Crowley talks about in The Invention of Comfort that the average room temperature would have been about 50 degrees, which we would not have considered to be kind of room temperature, right? That would have seemed chilly to us. To the point where, you know, it's interesting that Hal showed an image of stoves in churches. You know, one of the interesting kind of impediments to installing stoves in churches was the idea that it was, you know, kind of ungodly to be warm while you worshiped. And in fact, churches would break into sometimes anti-stove and pro-stove factions. So again, another kind of argument for why home heating, which we take for granted now, is so important.
Fascinating. Okay, how about safety issues with the use of wood stoves and inserts in early America? Were there CO poisoning, chimney fires, and how did that affect technology development?
Sean, you look as if you want to say something.
I'll let you guys answer that one.
It's a genuine question, but about the only way that you can trace this, apart from newspaper reports of fires, is town ordinances, which you really do begin to see them, but only early 19th century onwards. Ordinances about safe installation of stoves, regulations on chimney sweeps, allowing chimney sweeps to charge more if there was a stove in the fireplace, etc. So it's recognized that there is a danger. But on the other hand, Americans are kind of used to fire danger. Buildings are burning down all the time anyway. I don't think that the stove is regarded as a particularly exceptional or novel problem.
Just to add two things, in Franklin's pamphlet that he printed himself to describe his first fireplace inserts, and I recommend this reading as a way to take down all your competition to say what's wrong with their heating systems. And Franklin does mention the practice used in workshops, especially sometimes homes with workshops that don't have a fireplace, so how to keep warm. People bring in pots of charcoal to burn. And he says, well, keep the door open because otherwise it's going to get very unpleasant or fatal. So a very, very clear recognition of the problems of having inadequately ventilated spaces for artificial heating. And a kind of warning about all of the more desperate measures that probably people were using during the Little Ice Age. When, what do you want? To have a permanent headache from the charcoal or be very cold? So that 50-degree indoor temperature is interesting and instructive. Even toward the end of the 18th century, medical authorities were saying, look, don't have a room above 58 degrees. And that is, in a sense, not only about the temperature the body would be at, but the consequences for ventilation in a room that would be so forcingly heated in very cold weather.
Okay, thanks. So two people had a question. Actually, I would add myself. I don't understand this myself. What makes a 9 or 10 plate stove versus a 6 plate stove? I think some of the things you're showing, they seem to be still 6 plated, but you were referring them to more plates.
The extra 3 or 4 plates are inside. The 6 plates are the overall box, but then you cut a hole through the middle of the box, another 4 plates around it, and that's your oven.
I see.
That's a 10 plate. What they figured out really rather quickly is that you could economize as well as improving the size of the oven by using the front plate of the stove to kind of close one side of the oven. So we only needed another 3 plates. So that's why you get the difference between a 9 plate and a 10 plate. But to complicate matters even a little further, because 10 plate was the established name for these devices, you still call them 10 plates even if they've only got 9.
Okay. And there's a question is, how did they actually test for efficiency? And how did they know what was more efficient and what was less efficient?
Marcus Bull, a Philadelphia scientist and also actually promoter of stoves and of anthracite heating, developed the first more or less scientific test that one can use, which is to say he had a special experimental closed room built, which was insulated, and he tested to what temperature you could raise the air in that room and sustain it over a long period for X amount of fuel, okay? So that meant that his efficiency readings were really pretty damn good. I think that I'm not going to say that they're absolutely comparable with modern fuel efficiency readings, but he really could say that in device A, if you add X pounds of coal or wood, it'll keep the room at a certain temperature. I think his test temperature was 60 degrees, wasn't it? And it would keep it at that temperature for a certain length of time. So by the 1810s, then, it was actually possible for American scientists to come up with good interpretations of what was a more or less efficient heating appliance.
Joyce, did Franklin?
I do think it's interesting that this is exactly the era when scientists use their bodies as
Mm.
instruments of verification. So Franklin is the guy who determined that atmospheric electricity could be generated from lightning using his hand to get that snap to confirm it. And he, interestingly, in his stove pamphlet and all of his other writings, says you do not need a thermometer to verify whether your room is warm enough. You use your body for that.
Mm.
In the later Smoky Chimneys pamphlet that I referred to, he says there's a problem if you are trying to test how warm it is in the upper part of a room. And sure, you could hold a thermometer up there, but you could use another kind of a piece of equipment, which is a step stool. That you just get up on it and put your head high enough where you can perceive, well, what is the temperature up there? And I think it's a very interesting way of thinking about, well, what is efficiency? What is the payoff for this? Are you warm enough without having to pay? I mean, he's talking about what the fuel would eventually cost for your level of comfort. And this is why this calibration in the late 18th century of how warm it was, what the fuel costs, is the air clean even as you're becoming warmer? So the efficiency is very interestingly calibrated for a population that would not have scientific instruments and would have to use their personal experience to verify whether they were satisfied with how their household felt.
Yeah.
Maybe a last one for Sean. We're about to wrap up. I want to end at 2:30, be respectful of everyone's time. But this is a company in Vermont who replaced one of the last coal burners in 2020 with wood pellets. And he's wondering how many buildings still heat with coal or homes.
Not, I couldn't answer that. What's interesting to me as a historian of the coal industry in the 19th century is anthracite coal, bituminous coal. I mean, it was ubiquitous. It's why, for example, when you get when Santa's mad at you, he puts coal in your stocking, right? And people have asked me why that's the case, and it's like, it's not that coal has any kind of special symbolism. It's just coal was something that was around. So it'd be like today putting like dryer lint in your stocking. It was just everywhere. And what I find fascinating is, so the company that replaced it with wood pellets, I don't know that you can use coal for home heating now. The coal that they use now is mostly lignite. As I said, Wyoming is the #1 coal producing state. It's what's called washed, which is processed into these very, very finely ground things, and it's used mainly at power plants. So I don't believe that you can even use anthracite. And now this crisis occurred early in the 20th century, to the point where anthracite companies were trying desperately to get people to keep burning anthracite and not replace it with an electric burner or a gas burner. One anthracite company, my favorite story about this is they would actually spray paint their anthracite blue. And then they would say, when you're burning the blue, you're burning the best, and it was a way for them to kind of market their product. I can't imagine the kind of fumes that would come up from burning coal with paint. So, and what's really striking, I think, is the rapidity to which particularly oil and electric burners kind of replaced coal furnaces, to the point where many houses, I mean, not in Florida because we're warm, but many houses up north, you'll have still a coal cellar that's been converted into something else. But that's the original use, it was a coal cellar. You had to have, it was basically a battery for a house, right? You had to have somewhere to store your fuel. I would be hard pressed to figure out if you could find anybody to deliver coal to your house to burn.
Actually, you can. There are about 250,000 Americans, mostly in Pennsylvania and northern, actually up to Ohio and Maryland, who heat with coal. The stove is not regulated by the EPA, so anyone can, buy one, and there's still companies that sell it. It's very affordable. In fact, some very, people in dire poverty who will still go around train tracks and gather their own coal to burn at home.
It's rumored that there's still a private club in the greater Boston area that has a coal burning stove that they fire up. it seems like this is deliberately anachronistic, right? And I have no idea where they get their coal.
And coal-fired pizza is very famous.
Oh gosh, yes, I've forgotten about that.
So anyway, I want to thank you.
I still burn coal, and one point about the matter of comfort and efficiency. Whether you're burning wood or coal of different kinds, and what kind of whatever sort of appliance you burn it on, it's actually a labor-intensive process until you get to your pellet stoves and your electronically regulated modern stoves. A stove is something that you have to kind of look after. I mean, I burn coal and wood at home, and in a modern appliance, and even there, it's a certain amount of sweat. So when you can, if you can replace that with an appliance that's more or less self-regulating, people won't worry too much about whether it's also more expensive or more efficient or more thermally efficient or whatever. The gain in or the reduction in labor is sufficient reward.
Hal, where do you get your coal from? Because one of the things I always say in my global history of energy class is the spectacular statistic is that there are no coal miners in the UK right now, that all the coal mines have closed.
Yeah, there are still open cast coal.
Okay.
And we import a hell of a lot of coal from Poland.
It's literally bringing coal to Newcastle, right? I mean,
it's literally bringing coal to Newcastle.
Well, we won't get into heating with peat fires right now, but that's another fuel that is unique to the United Kingdom. Anyway, thank you all. It's a little bit after 1:33. I found this fascinating. We didn't get to a bunch of questions and a bunch of comments, which shows many people found it fascinating. And this will be online, and I encourage folks, I assume it's okay for us to share your emails if
Absolutely,
yeah, absolutely.
Invite questions.
Okay, great. So for all of you who asked questions that we didn't get to, or we'll be sharing the emails, you can email them directly. So thanks again, and enjoy your warm summer, and I hope you have an equally warm winter.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.